In the winter of 1913, the mining town of Alder Ridge felt like a place the world had forgotten. Snow buried the crooked wooden houses. Smoke from chimneys rose thin and weak into a gray sky. Work had slowed in the mines, and hunger had begun creeping into the village like a silent visitor that refused to leave. And for one boy, survival had already become a daily battle. 15-year-old Daniel Carter walked alone along the frozen edge of the town road. His coat was torn. His boots were 2 sizes too big and stuffed with cloth. 3 days earlier, the boarding house that had taken him in after his parents died had turned him away. There simply wasn't enough food anymore. No one hated him. No one wished him harm. But no one could afford to keep him either. The wind cut across the valley and Daniel wrapped his arms tighter around himself. He had no money, no family, no place to sleep, just the cold. And the quiet understanding that if he didn't figure something out soon, winter would end his story. He looked toward the distant mountains where abandoned mines dotted the hills like dark scars in the earth. People avoided those places. Collapsed tunnels, poisonous air, stories of miners who never came back. But desperation changes the way a person thinks. Because when you have nowhere left to go, would you dare walk into a place everyone else is afraid of? Daniel turned toward the hills and began walking. By late afternoon, Daniel reached a narrow trail that curved around the rocky slope of Alder Ridge. There, hidden behind leaning pine trees and tangled brush, he saw it, a mine entrance. Old wooden beams framed the opening, many of them cracked and warped with age. Rusted rails disappeared into darkness where carts once carried ore out of the mountain. The town called it Black Hollow Mine. It had been abandoned nearly 30 years earlier after a collapse killed several miners. Since then, no one had returned. Daniel stepped closer. Cold air drifted from the entrance, carrying the scent of wet stone and earth. Inside, the darkness felt deep and endless. His heart pounded. A place like this could collapse. It could trap him, or worse. Something inside might already be living there. He picked up a broken lantern lying near the entrance and shook it. Miraculously, the wick still worked. A small flame flickered to life. The light pushed back the darkness just enough to reveal the first tunnel. Rock walls, wooden supports, dust thick as fog. If you were standing here, staring into that silent tunnel, would you go inside, or turn around and face the freezing night instead? Daniel stepped forward. The mine swallowed him whole. The deeper Daniel walked, the quieter the world became. At first, he could still hear the faint whisper of the wind outside, but with every step deeper into the tunnel, that sound slowly faded. Wind disappeared. Snow vanished. Alder Ridge fell away behind him. Soon, even the distant noises of the town were completely gone, until the only thing he could hear was the slow drip of water. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop struck the stone floor, its sound traveling through the hollow passages like a quiet heartbeat inside the mountain. Daniel raised the lantern slightly higher, letting its small circle of light crawl across the walls. The rock surfaces glistened with moisture. The tunnel stretched in several directions, splitting into narrow passages supported by old timber beams that looked untouched for decades. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by Daniel's cautious steps. He moved slowly, carefully watching the ceiling above him. Some of the beams were cracked. Others leaned slightly, their bases buried in old debris. The entire place felt fragile and forgotten. After several minutes of walking, Daniel noticed a narrow opening branching off the main tunnel. He stepped inside. The passage widened into a small side chamber carved roughly into the rock. The ceiling here looked lower but more solid. Daniel lifted the lantern toward the roof, studying the rock carefully. It wasn't perfect, but compared to the rest, it looked stable. The ground beneath his feet was also different. Instead of loose rubble, this chamber had a relatively flat surface of packed dirt. More importantly, it was dry. Most of the chamber remained clear of dripping moisture, though a few drops fell near the far wall. Daniel lowered the lantern slowly and looked around. It wasn't comfortable, but it was sheltered. No icy gusts pushed against him. For the first time in days, the wind wasn't cutting through his clothes. Just the quiet, enclosed stillness of the underground. Daniel exhaled slowly, realizing how tense his body had been. Then he began searching the nearby tunnels for anything to help him survive. Along the rail track, he found pieces of broken boards, fragments from old crates. He carried them one by one into the chamber. The boards were rough, but they would keep him from the freezing ground. He spread them across the dirt to form a thin barrier. Beside a rusted mining cart, Daniel noticed several torn burlap sacks lying in a dusty pile. The fabric was stiff with age, but intact. He gathered them and brought them back. Using the sacks, he created a rough bedding. It wasn't much, but it felt like a victory. The lantern's dim light flickered as Daniel finally sat down. The mine air was cold, but strangely steady, unlike the brutal outside wind. Daniel slowly curled up beneath his makeshift blanket, pulling the burlap close. For a while, he simply listened as the mountain breathed. Drip, drip, drip. The water continued falling, each sound echoing. At first the silence was terrifying. Every small noise felt larger. His mind imagined the dangers, collapses, poisonous air, men who vanished. Yet the longer Daniel lay there, the sounds began to change. The dripping water stopped feeling threatening. Instead, it became steady, predictable, almost calming, like a slow rhythm. He knew something important. He wasn't freezing in the snow. He had walls around him, shelter above, and a small flame in the darkness. He might actually survive the night. But survival for one night means nothing if the next morning brings hunger again. Eventually, the body demands food, energy, a plan. If you woke up in a dark mine with no food, what would you fix first? Daniel stared quietly at the lantern flame as it flickered beside him, and slowly an idea began forming in his mind. Daniel already had an idea. Morning light barely reached the entrance of the mine. Outside, the winter sun had begun climbing slowly over the mountains of Alder Ridge, but its pale light struggled to push through the pine trees. Inside the tunnels, the darkness still ruled. Only a faint gray glow crept across the first few wooden beams near the opening. The light barely touched the dusty rails that disappeared deeper into the mountain. Farther inside, where Daniel had spent the night, the light never arrived. When Daniel opened his eyes, the lantern beside him had burned almost completely out. Its small flame had faded into a dull ember. For a moment he simply lay still, listening. The mine sounded exactly the same as it had the night before. Drip, drip, drip. Water continued falling slowly from the stones somewhere down the tunnels. The mountain felt calm. Still, Daniel sat up and pulled the rough burlap sack tighter around his shoulders as the chill air brushed against his face. But when he turned and walked back toward the deeper tunnels, the air changed again. The deeper tunnels weren't colder than the entrance. In fact, they were warmer. Daniel paused in the middle of the track and held his hand out into the air, testing the difference. The temperature didn't swing wildly like it did outside in the valley. Instead, it remained almost the same everywhere underground. The mountain acted like a giant barrier between him and the brutal winter outside. The mine wasn't just shelter, it was insulation. Daniel's eyes moved deeper into the tunnels. For the first time, he began to look at it differently. Not as dangerous, but filled with possibilities. He spent hours exploring. Some tunnels branched off into narrow passages, others widened into large corridors, where rail tracks once carried heavy carts. To avoid getting lost, Daniel began marking his path with chalky white stones. 1 stone for a safe path, 2 for a dead end. Some tunnels collapsed completely, blocked by piles of rock and broken timber. Others remained surprisingly open, their wooden supports standing like old guardians. He followed one narrow shaft twisting upward. As he walked, he felt something brush across his face, a faint movement in the air. Fresh air slipped through a crack high above. Ventilation, fresh air meant the tunnels could breathe. Smoke could escape. Along the floor, water from the dripping stone had gathered in shallow pools. Daniel knelt beside one. The water looked clean and fresh. Drinking water, another problem solved. Daniel sat quietly, staring at the small pool. Drip, drip, drip. Shelter, steady temperature, fresh air, water. This place wasn't just an abandoned mine. It could become a home. But homes aren't built with ideas alone. They require work. Hard, exhausting work. Clearing debris, moving stone. Most would see danger and leave. But Daniel had already crossed the line where turning back was possible. He didn't hesitate. Daniel picked up a broken board lying near the rails, and he started clearing rubble. The first week was brutal. Daniel quickly discovered that turning an abandoned mine into a home was harder than simply surviving a night. Every inch of the chamber he had chosen as his base required work. Hard, exhausting work. The floor was covered with rocks and broken boards. Dust clung to everything, and the damp earth made the ground cold and uncomfortable. So Daniel began with the simplest task, clearing space. He moved rocks one at a time, stacking them carefully against the wall. Some stones were easy to move, but others were heavy and rough, forcing him to drag them slowly across the floor. Lift, carry, drop, hours passed with the quiet echo of stone against stone. Slowly, the piles of debris shrank, and a clearer area appeared. Once the ground was clear, Daniel turned to something even more important: sleeping. The damp floor pulled warmth from his body at night. He searched the tunnels and found broken planks from old mining carts. He carried these back to his chamber one by one. Using the strongest boards, he built a simple frame for a raised bed. It wasn't perfect, but it lifted him above the damp ground. Next, Daniel focused on warmth. He noticed a thin crack in the rock where fresh air flowed through the mine. Using loose stones, he carved a shallow fire pit directly into the floor. Eventually, it was deep enough to safely contain a small fire. When he lit it, something remarkable happened. Instead of filling the chamber with smoke, the ventilation crack pulled the smoke upward. Warmth stayed inside the chamber without turning it into a trap. Daniel watched carefully, relieved that his plan worked. After sleep and fire, Daniel began shaping the walls. He built crude shelves directly into the rock, using stone wedges and timber. The shelves weren't elegant, but they held his tools and lanterns safely off the ground. Piece by piece, the chamber transformed. Every improvement made the space feel less like a cave and more like a shelter, a place shaped by human hands. A cleared floor, a raised bed, a controlled fire. Together, these changes created a space that felt intentional and protective. The work exhausted him. By the end of each day, Daniel's arms felt heavy and his shoulders burned from the effort. His fingers blistered from gripping rough stone. Sometimes, he sat by the fire, breathing slowly as fatigue settled into his muscles. Yet, despite the pain, the mine stopped feeling like a place of fear. The shadows no longer felt dangerous. Every creak and drip used to sound like a warning. Now, the mine felt like a project, a puzzle waiting to be solved. Each improvement proved that the mountain could be understood. Daniel began to see the mine not as an enemy, but as a partner. Imagine finding that the place everyone fears is actually the safest place to live. Daniel made his choice. He chose improvement, and he was only getting started. One afternoon, while searching the forest for firewood, Daniel heard footsteps behind him. The sound was faint at first, a soft crunch of snow somewhere between the tall pine trees that covered the hillside. Daniel immediately froze. His hands tightened around the small bundle of dry branches he had gathered. For a moment, the forest fell completely silent. Cold winter air drifted quietly between the trees, carrying the sharp scent of pine. Then the sound came again. Crunch. A slow, steady step pressing into the snow. Daniel's heart began to beat faster. He had grown used to the quiet isolation of the mountains. Most people from Alder Ridge avoided these slopes near the abandoned mines. Daniel slowly turned around. Between the tall trunks of the pine trees, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. A tall man with broad shoulders and a thick gray beard. His heavy coat looked worn from years of hard work. The man studied Daniel quietly for a moment before speaking. His name was Walter Hayes, a retired miner. Walter had spent much of his life underground, carving tunnels through stone and hauling ore from deep inside the mountain. Earlier that day, Walter had noticed something unusual, a faint trail of smoke rising slowly from the old mine entrance below. No one had used that mine for nearly 30 years. Curious and slightly concerned, he followed the smoke down the hillside to investigate. At first, Walter thought the boy was foolish. Living inside an abandoned mine was dangerous due to unstable ceilings and bad air. Walter followed Daniel back toward the mine entrance, watching silently as the boy carried his wood inside. When they reached the chamber Daniel had been building, Walter stopped. His eyes slowly scanned the room. The cleared floor, the raised bed built from old planks, and the carefully carved stone fire pit near the ventilation crack. The changes were simple and improvised, but they were also intelligent. Every piece served a purpose. Walter's expression slowly changed. The boy hadn't simply hidden inside the mine. He had begun shaping it into something functional. Walter knelt beside the stone ring Daniel had built and studied the airflow as thin smoke drifted upward. Then he looked back at Daniel. "You've got instincts," he said quietly. The words carried the weight of decades. Over the next few days, Walter returned several times. Each visit brought a new lesson that only miners truly understood. Walter showed Daniel how to reinforce ceilings using angled support beams to handle the pressure of the rock above. He also demonstrated how to split flat stone slabs. Large stones could be shaped into solid surfaces for walls or shelves. Stone lasted longer than wood underground. It didn't rot, and it didn't splinter. Then Walter explained how to read cracks in the rock. Small fractures could reveal enormous pressure building above the tunnel. Experienced miners learned to recognize those warning signs before a collapse ever happened. For Daniel, every lesson opened another piece of the puzzle. The mine was no longer just a place he was surviving in. Now he was beginning to understand it. How it worked, how it moved, how it could be strengthened. Have you ever met someone whose experience suddenly made everything you were struggling with much easier to understand? For Daniel, that meeting changed everything. With Walter's advice, Daniel began transforming the mine into something far more advanced. The small chamber that had once been nothing more than a rough shelter slowly began turning into a carefully planned living space. Every change Daniel made now followed the lessons Walter had shown him during their conversations inside the tunnels. The mine was no longer just a place where he slept. It was becoming something far more deliberate, far more intelligent. Daniel's first improvement focused on warmth. The small fire pit already provided heat, but it disappeared quickly into the cold air. Walter had explained a simple solution miners used: thermal mass. So Daniel began gathering large stones from the surrounding tunnels. One by one, he stacked them behind the fire pit. The stones formed a thick wall where flames could heat them slowly. At first, the change didn't seem dramatic. But after several nights, Daniel noticed something remarkable. The rocks warmed gradually while the fire burned, and once the flames faded, those stones continued releasing heat. The chamber stayed warmer for hours after the fire had died down. Instead of sleeping in sudden cold, Daniel now rested in a space where the warmth slowly faded instead of disappearing all at once. Encouraged by that success, Daniel turned his attention to food storage. The winter air outside could freeze vegetables quickly. Walter explained that deeper tunnels acted like natural storage, so Daniel began digging a storage pit farther inside one of the side tunnels. The deeper he worked, the more stable the temperature became, cool, dark, and protected from sudden temperature swings. Eventually, the pit became deep enough to safely hold food. It acted like a natural refrigerator. Whenever Daniel collected vegetables or roots from nearby abandoned farms or frozen fields, he stored them carefully inside the pit. Hidden underground, the food lasted far longer than it would have outside. Next came light. The deeper areas remained permanently dark, forcing him to rely on lanterns whenever he needed to work. But near the entrance, sunlight still reached the first stretch of tunnel. Daniel wondered if that light could be used more effectively. Using scraps of metal and pieces of broken mirror glass, he began experimenting with reflection. He positioned the metal sheets carefully. Then he angled the broken mirrors to catch sunlight as it streamed into the mine. The result surprised him. Instead of fading, the sunlight bounced from one reflective surface to another, traveling farther into the tunnel. The effect wasn't perfect, but the reflected light brightened the first sections enough for Daniel to move around without a lantern. Each improvement brought a quiet sense of progress. The mine was evolving into a hidden underground home, a place where heat was stored, food preserved, and even sunlight stretched deeper through simple reflection. Daniel often stood quietly near the entrance, looking back. It no longer felt like a dark, frightening mine. It felt organized and intentional. If you had the chance to design a secret home inside a mountain, what feature would you build first? Daniel didn't stop to wonder for long. He kept building, because winter was coming again, and this time he intended to be ready. The storm arrived in late December. At first it began quietly. Thin snowflakes drifted down from a heavy gray sky, settling across the rooftops and covering the narrow streets in a soft white layer. But within days, the weather changed. The wind strengthened. Dark clouds rolled across the mountains, and the snowfall became relentless. Snowstorms buried Alder Ridge beneath nearly 6 feet of snow. The small wooden houses struggled beneath the growing weight. Roofs creaked under the pressure, and some eventually collapsed when the snow became too heavy to hold. Wood supplies began running low. Fires that once burned steadily throughout the night now had to be rationed carefully. People wrapped themselves in blankets and coats, trying to hold on to whatever warmth remained inside their homes. Outside, the storm roared across the valley, but deep inside Black Hollow Mine, Daniel's shelter held steady. The thick layers of earth and stone surrounding the tunnels created a natural barrier against the brutal weather above. The stone walls trapped warmth inside the chamber he had built, absorbing warmth from the fire and releasing it gradually. Behind the fire pit, the thermal stones Daniel had carefully stacked performed exactly the way Walter had explained. Then, long after the flames had faded, those stones continued releasing heat into the chamber. Ventilation shafts continued pulling fresh air through the tunnels, allowing smoke from the fire to escape. The air remained clean and breathable. For the first time since losing his family, Daniel slept through a winter storm without fear. The mountain protected him. While the storm raged across Alder Ridge, Daniel rested quietly inside the shelter he had built with his own hands. Above ground, the town suffered. Firewood grew scarce, cold air invaded homes that had once felt safe, but below ground, a 15-year-old boy had built something stronger than most houses, something the storm could not touch. When nature becomes ruthless, do you think preparation matters more than strength? Preparation wins? But the story of his underground shelter did not remain hidden forever. Eventually, the truth spread. A few brave townspeople followed those smoke trails through the snow until they reached the entrance of Black Hollow Mine. At first they were shocked. The abandoned mine was supposed to be dangerous, yet faint light flickered inside the tunnels. Then they saw Daniel, in the chamber he had built. The raised bed, the stone fire pit, the organized shelves. Daniel didn't chase them away. Instead, he showed them everything. He explained how the stone walls held heat. Some families listened carefully, and soon, they began copying his ideas. Root cellars, stone heat storage, ventilation tunnels. The boy who once had nothing was now teaching others how to survive the cold mountains of Alder Ridge. Slowly, the abandoned mine became something unexpected, a network of hidden shelters inside the rock, spaces where warmth could be preserved. If you discovered a place that could protect people during the worst winters, would you keep it secret, or would you share it? Daniel made his choice. He chose to share, and that decision quietly changed the entire valley. Years passed, the quiet mining town of Alder Ridge continued to change slowly as the decades moved forward. Seasons came and went across the valley. Winters buried the mountains in snow, and spring always returned with melting ice and rushing streams. Through all those years, the story of the boy who had once walked into an abandoned mine slowly became something the villagers often talked about. Daniel Carter grew into a skilled builder and engineer. What had begun as a desperate attempt to survive slowly turned into a lifetime of learning. The lessons he discovered deep inside Black Hollow Mine shaped the way he understood the world. He understood stone. He understood how air moved through narrow tunnels. He understood how heat could be stored inside thick rock and released slowly through long winter nights. Those ideas had not come from books or classrooms. They had come from observation, from trial and error, from patience and hard work inside a silent mountain. But the heart of his story never changed. It always began the same way, with a hungry 15-year-old boy walking into a dead mine because he had nowhere else to go. That moment, one simple decision made in desperation had quietly shaped everything that followed. The chambers he built still existed decades later. Stone beds carefully raised above the cold ground. Hidden food storage pits carved deeper into the tunnels where vegetables could remain cool for months. Ventilation passages shaped with patient hands so fresh air could travel through the underground rooms. The work had been simple, but it had been thoughtful, and most importantly, it had lasted. Over time, the villagers began calling the place the Hidden Home. Not because it was secret, everyone in Alder Ridge knew exactly where the tunnels were, but because the mine had proven something powerful. Sometimes the place everyone fears the most becomes a place where the greatest ideas are born. One evening, many years later, Daniel stood quietly at the entrance of the mine, the same entrance he had once approached as a frightened boy. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and long golden light stretched across the valley of Alder Ridge. The wind moved gently through the pine trees as the last daylight slowly faded across the snow-dusted hills. Daniel looked out across the valley for a long moment, and he remembered. He remembered the cold day he had first stepped inside the mine. Alone, hungry, uncertain. At that moment, he had not been thinking about building a shelter. He had not been thinking about survival systems or underground homes. He had simply been trying to survive one more night, one more storm, one more day. And yet from that single desperate decision, something extraordinary had slowly grown. If that frightened boy could see what he eventually built, what do you think he would say? Maybe the answer would be something simple, something honest. Because sometimes survival doesn't begin with strength. Sometimes it begins with one desperate step into the unknown. A single decision made when there are no safe choices left, and the courage to keep building, one stone at a time, until even the darkest place in the mountain becomes a home.